Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network, where you could enjoy benefits such as access to our entire back catalogue. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 29, Episode 4. Charlemagne, the Father of Europe, Part 1. This episode was written by Murray Dahm. Murray Dahm is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Combat 40, Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Alexander Confronts the Achaemenids 334 to 331 BC from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Charles the Great, known as Charlemagne and the Father of Europe, created an empire which would last 1,000 years. To secure it, he fought continuously on multiple fronts throughout his long reign. Charlemagne came to power at a time when Europe was made up of many small kingdoms and principalities. Since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, it had also faced invasion from various peoples who had established kingdoms of their own, such as the Visigoths and Muslims in Spain. There were also new peoples on the outskirts of Europe who were either asserting themselves for the first time, such as the Danes and Norse, or intent on breaking into Europe itself, such as the Avars. Europe also clung to the past and saw itself as a continuation of the Western Roman Empire. Throughout his reign, 768 to 814, Charlemagne, his sons and commanders fought almost continuous wars of expansion and aggression. By the end of his reign, he had created an empire which bore his name, Carolingian, which reached from Spain to the Balkans, Italy to the Baltic. First lessons in war. Charlemagne's age is one of many areas of controversy in the sources for his reign. The most probable date of his birth has been established as April 742, making him 26 when he acceded to the throne. This, however, would mean he was born 2 years before his parents were married. One source, the Annales Petaviani, claims he was born in 747, but this would have made him only 21. No source names the place of his birth, and there are several candidates. Charlemagne became co-king of the Franks with his brother Charlemagne in 768. He was 26 and his brother 17. Despite his young age, he was already an experienced commander, with more than a decade of experience, having fought in the wars of his father, Pepin the Short. Our major source for his reign is the Vita Caroli Manni, written by Einhard in the 9th century. This tells us that Charlemagne was 70 when he died in January 814. Einhard was an eyewitness to Charlemagne's reign and wrote under his son Louis the Pious. This source gives us remarkable and reliable insights, but Einhard also wrote to show Charlemagne in the best possible light, and so he omits or slants several episodes which would not have suited that purpose. Einhard wrote that Charlemagne was by far the most able and noble-spirited of all who ruled over nations in this time. He never withdrew from an enterprise which he had once begun, and was determined to see through to the end simply because of the labour involved, and danger never deterred him. Although these are presented as noble and good traits, we see a glimpse of Charlemagne's determination and even his aggression. The large number of sieges he undertook may also be a testament to his determination and tenacity. At the age of 15, Charlemagne's father had given him the command of duchies in Austrasia, whose loyalty was suspect. He was also involved in military expeditions to Aquitania against the rebellious lords there who had resisted Pepin's rule for 20 years. They were assisted by the Vascons, Basques. Usually a Carolingian ruler commanded in person, and so we can expect that the military training of Charlemagne began at an early age. He may have accompanied his father on campaign as young as 13. If the king could not be present, then he would be presented on the field by his majordome. Command in frontier regions was given to loyal vassal subjects, and so there was an opportunity for mobility and reward if you proved yourself reliable. Success in the Aquitania campaigns finally came in 768, shortly before Pepin's death. Frankish law demanded that the empire be divided between Pepin's sons, and so the empire was divided between Charlemagne and Carloman. This law would cause great problems for Europe in the time of Charlemagne's grandsons. The Duke of Aquitania lost no time in rebelling again. Charlemagne marched against him and asked for support from his brother, but they argued, and Charlemagne was forced to fight alone. He did so and won a swift victory. There was tension between the brothers as each jockeyed for position. On December the 4th, 771, Charlemagne died, probably of natural causes despite his young age. He was only 21. This left Charlemagne as sole ruler. Charlemagne needed to assert his dominance over his already large domain, and he spent a decade aggressively bending his subjects to his will. His first act was to ensure that all his brother's followers swore allegiance to him. Charlemagne was an imposing figure, estimated at 6 feet tall, one of the tallest men of the age. But he needed to prove himself to the kingdom at large as well, and so war was not far away. The Saxons, pagans who lived between the Oder and Elbe rivers, had been pushing southwards. In 772, Charlemagne launched an unprovoked attack on the Saxons to show his mettle to his followers and prove his stature to his subjects. He may also have sought to solve the Saxon problem decisively. He warred with the Saxons for 30 years and fought 18 battles. Charlemagne's determination, tenacity and success, regardless of the effort required in his campaigns against the Saxons, revealed aspects of his personality which his contemporaries could have learned from. Many of Charlemagne's campaigns are either dealt with very briefly in sources like the Royal Frankish Annals, or at the other extreme are embellished into legend, such as in the Song of Roland. Some of these accounts are not particularly useful, although we can sometimes extrapolate details. For the Saxon campaign in 772, we know that Charlemagne assembled his nobles at Worms, marched into Saxony, captured Eresburg, and got as far as the pagan idol of the Irminsul, a giant tree trunk considered one of the pillars of heaven, which he destroyed and then plundered Saxon territory. As brief as this account is, it tells us from the start that this was both a military and religious conflict. We also know that Charlemagne conducted many sieges in his wars, often without details of how. Siege techniques such as ladders and battering rams had been in place for centuries. The Avars may have introduced the mangonel to Europe warfare, although such technology may also have come via Muslim Spain. A later campaign against the Saxons is described only as, with a mighty army and the name of Christ on his lips, Charlemagne sallied forth to Saxony. Or in 781, the campaign into Bavaria is described: "Then the Lord King Charles, together with the Franks, seeing the justice of his cause, prepared a campaign." Sometimes we can deduce that Charlemagne sought to penetrate right to the centre of enemy territory. He also sent multiple armies, 2 into Spain in 778 and 3 separate forces into Bavaria in 787 and 788. In 775 his campaign against Saxons penetrated deeply, reaching Ocker, and he took prisoners from 3 districts. They had to accept baptism and then recognize the rule of the Franks. The nature of Charlemagne's campaign was such that, while he was occupied in one place, rebellious regions would throw off the yoke and revolt. While Charlemagne was in Italy in 773, the Saxons took the opportunity to take revenge for the campaign of 772 and sacked several churches and monasteries. Charlemagne regarded these acts as violated treaties. Each campaigning season would end with a new treaty with the Saxons, and these were virtually all broken. However, the treaties never encompassed all Saxons who had no centralized leadership. Oaths and hostages were a major part of securing the peace for Charlemagne throughout Europe. He held hostages at his court from across his empire and vassal states beyond it. Some aspects of Charlemagne's many campaigns remain controversial, despite the overwhelmingly positive image of him that survives. Sometimes the sources are entirely silent. It is probable that the Royal Frankish Annals are Charlemagne's own version of events, certainly a version of which he approved. They provide legitimacy for all of his actions and ignore events and setbacks, such as in Spain in 778. They also exaggerate some successes, especially those against the Saxons. Charlemagne also became a protector of the Pope, just as his father had been. Indeed, this protection had seen his father supplant the Merovingian kings of Francia and saw Charlemagne become the champion of the Pope and Christianity. This saw him invited to interfere in Italian affairs and eventually crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800. There is no doubt Charlemagne was sincere in his Christianity, but there was also opportunism in his siding with the Pope. He also saw the opportunity to enlarge his power and his empire. Charlemagne's campaigns against the pagan Saxons, 773 to 804, were all wars of aggressive, forcible conversion. They were conducted with the catch cry of baptism or death. Yet resistance continued, and when Widukind organised a fresh round of resistance in the 780s, Charlemagne personally led the campaign to exact vengeance for yet another broken treaty. This led to the massacre of 4,500 Saxon prisoners at Verden in 782. Campaigning continued, and in 783 Charlemagne twice threw himself into the middle of the fray. So furious was he at Saxon treachery, according to Einhard, chapter 8. Even Widukind was eventually forced to accept baptism. Charlemagne also warred with the Muslims in Spain. According to tradition, he fought to preserve and assist the Christian kingdoms which remained in the Iberian Peninsula. This meant in reality adding them as states who owed their loyalties to him. Not all his campaigns were ones of faith, however. He also warred with rival Christians in Spain, Italy, and in several rebellions with his empire. In 787 he ruthlessly overthrew the legitimate Merovingian Duke of Bavaria and was at pains to justify his actions. He eliminated the Duchy of Bavaria and forced its last Duke, Tassilo, to become a monk. The defeat of Charlemagne's forces at Roncesvalles in 778 was perpetrated by untrustworthy Christian Vascones. Even though Charlemagne was painted as the shining Christian champion, he was both a ruthless and pragmatic king and commander. He often put a great deal of thought and planning into a campaign, but could also be impulsive and opportunistic. This was rewarded in his actions towards the Pope, but in Spain in 778, quite the opposite. He could accept the submission of Muslim or pagan leaders when it suited him, but he could be brutal to even fellow Christians when he felt the need. He also made and broke alliances when it suited him. In 777, he agreed to help the Muslim Sulayman al-Arabi against the emir of Abd ar-Rahman. There was as much infighting in Muslim Spain as there was throughout Christian Europe. This allowed him to claim that he was fighting a defensive campaign, when in fact it was yet another war of aggression. The later tradition of making this a proto-crusade on behalf of Spanish Christians, however, could not have been further from the truth. Charlemagne underestimated the dangers of the Spanish campaign and failed to carry out any intelligence gathering. The campaign was almost a complete disaster, something our brief sources try their best not to convey. The one thing which may have saved Charlemagne was the amount of provisions he required his armies to have, as this allowed them to retreat through hostile territory. The allied cities of Barcelona and Zaragoza refused to let the Franks enter, and sieges were unsuccessful, forcing the whole expedition to retire. On the retreat up the Ebro, the rear guard was ambushed, not by Muslim forces, as the later Song of Roland would tell, but by Christian Vascones. The rear guard was massacred and the baggage train plundered. A number of high-ranking commanders, Egihard, Anshelm and Roland, fell. Egihard and Anshelm were among the most important members of the Frankish aristocracy. The Vascones melted away so quickly that Charlemagne could not exact revenge. And we will continue with the story of Charlemagne, the father of Europe, in a couple of weeks' time. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast and receive benefits, such as access to our entire back catalogue, then check out our Patreon campaign at Patreon, patreon.com/The History Network. And if you'd like to write a script for us, or you have an idea for a subject which you think we've not covered and you'd like to hear it covered on the podcast, then drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. Thanks once again to Murray Darm for writing this episode. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.